Hello everyone, I'm 10 Types, and in today's video I'm going to be ranking every single Pokemon TCG mechanic. Well, maybe not every single one. I'm starting Black and White and on because before Black and White some of the mechanics were really weird and repeated a lot. It's confusing enough as it is. In addition to that, mechanics like Battle Styles, Ancient and Future, Ultra Beast, and things like that aren't going to be ranked. Originally I was ranking them, but didn't quite fit in with the rest of them, and the ranking just didn't make sense. If you're interested in me ranking those types of mechanics, I could do that in some other video, so comment that down below if you're interested in that. But for now, let's talk about some of the criteria. Unsurprisingly, the main criteria will be how interesting the mechanic is. This is of course pretty subjective, but I think most of you will find my takes pretty reasonable. I'm also going to be taking into account balance, so if a card is balanced, that'll obviously be better. That being said, if a card is overpowered, I'd rather a card have some change into the game rather than it being underpowered and not changing anything at all. I know some people would tend to go the other way with this, but I personally don't really hate any mechanic, so any change for me is generally good. Lastly, if a mechanic doesn't have a lot of cards, then it may fall down the ranking a little because, well, spoilers, there's one mechanic that has only 2 cards, and that's not good. I generally said if a mechanic has 10 or more cards, that's fine, but any less than that, and it may fall down just a little. Oh, and one last thing, before we hop into the video, I want to just ask you to subscribe. I'm really excited to approach 1,000 subscribers, and I'm going to be making more edited content in the future. This is my first edited video, honestly, almost ever, and I'm really looking forward to improving in YouTube and just go forward to make much better content. Now let's kick things off with number 17, Ancient Traits. Ancient Trait mechanic is not the best mechanic. Honestly, it's hard to argue it's a mechanic in the first place. Ancient Traits are pretty much just abilities. They do, I don't know, they're just abilities. They technically aren't called abilities, and yeah, I guess you can kind of say like, oh, now my Pokemon has 2 abilities, which is something that hasn't exactly been done before, but it kind of has as well. I feel like Ancient Traits really haven't added too much to the game. Sure, some of them were fun, but some of them were kind of broken. Some of them were just kind of random and underwhelming as well. They're actually cool in GLC, and they were kind of cool in Standard, but overall, I feel like they just weren't very much of a mechanic at all. Number 16, Team Flare Gear. The Team Flare Gear cards were very strange. First of all, there were a bunch of them, but a lot of them weren't really a unique mechanic. There was a card like Battle Compressor, and there were a few others, but they were just regular cards, so they're not really being included in this because they weren't really a mechanic. The 2 cards we are going to be talking about are the Team Flare Gear tool cards, which were this really striking red design, which looked really cool. And then they had the word flare on the back, but that meant that they were really hard to read as well, which obviously isn't ideal. Now, what did they actually do? Well, first of all, they were tool cards, so you'd attach them to, well, you don't actually attach them to your Pokemon. You attach them to your opponent's Pokemon, specifically Pokemon EXs, and EXs were pretty prevalent, so this was fine. And then they had negative effects. This was really interesting because you could put them on your opponent's side to, 1, stop them from attaching a tool of their own, and 2, of course, inflict the negative effect. This was cool and a unique idea that hasn't really been implemented before or since, but they only made 2 of these, so they never really leaned into the mechanic that much. Of course, this mechanic sounds fine, potentially a little weird, but pretty cool as well, so why is it so low? Well, this in practicality was a big mess. Attaching cards to your opponent's Pokemon is not practical at all, because normally your Pokemon and your opponent's Pokemon are completely separate. And when playing physically, it was very easy to attach these cards to your opponent's Pokemon, and then they scoop up their cards to end the game at some point, take your cards with them, and now you've lost your cards. Okay, so that may be thinking, well, surely this is like something that you'd remember, but it's not. You could definitely forget it. Of course, implementing this online is also really awkward, as well as a few other mechanics. Team Flare Gear is one of the most awkward mechanics to physically and online implement, so unfortunately, Team Flare Gear, well, it was a cool concept, it was not really practical. Number 15, Pokemon Reunion. The Pokemon Reunion mechanic is another mechanic that in theory seems kind of cool, but in practicality had, well, it was weird. So reunions are currently in the TCG at the time of recording this, so many of you may be more familiar with them. But if you don't know, they are a card or 4 cards that combine to 1 card. They were really weird. First of all, they all had the same name, so you could only play 4 in total, meaning that you'd want one of each piece. Technically, you were allowed to have multiple of one piece, but then you could never actually play the card because you needed all 4. The way these worked were they were Pokemon V, which is interesting, but not necessarily super relevant, but they did give up 3 prizes, which is a lot. As I said, you need all 4, and not in your hand, you need them in the discard, which I guess is not awful to do. Of course, if you prized one or lost zoned one, well, then you weren't ever getting into play, but we'll just ignore that, I guess. And then you put them into play straight from the discard, and now you have this Pokemon that, well, it's kind of similar to a VMAX in power level, which we'll talk about, but unsurprisingly, VMAXs were easier to get into play than 4 cards that you only had 1 copy of each and you get in the discard. And when I say they're as good as VMAXs, they were as good as the mediocre to underwhelming VMAXs. They had just around 300, maybe a little more HP, had some decent attacks. In fact, each piece had its own attack, and some had abilities. So you could actually have a Pokemon with more than one ability, but they were all pretty tame, and they weren't very strong, the best of which was Mewtwo V Union. But for the most part, the mechanic was just very clunky and pretty bad. Of course, practically speaking, the cards are very big and awkward to use as well. We got these big cards, which I'm sure you've seen it for normal cards, but you had the big card. There was the whole V-Union, which was kind of cool. You could actually play, arguably, I don't know. It was very big and clunky, which is just something you would never expect to say for a Pokemon card. But in practicality, they're weird and bad, and Pokemon is only printed 5 of them, and they're clearly not going to bring them back. There was an older mechanic not covered in this video called Pokemon Legends, and they were 2 pieces, and those had problems of their own and were difficult to read. I don't know, but Pokemon V Unions did not really fix the issues with Pokemon Legends because adding more pieces was not the solution. Number 14, Amazing Rare Pokemon. Amazing Rare Pokemon are another type of Pokemon that aren't exactly a mechanic. It's hard to find out whether they are a mechanic or aren't online. A lot of people consider them a mechanic though, so I'll cover them in this video. They don't actually have any specific properties that become unique in like naming or playing officially, but unlike Pokemon such as Shining Pokemon, which are not covered in this video, Amazing Rares did have unique traits and generally how they were played, and they also were a unique rarity, I believe. Although, quite frankly, I don't really care. All that matters is that they were a little unique. And when I say a little unique, they were very unique. Amazing Rare Pokemon had interesting energy costs. In addition to the regular energy cost that is their energy type, they had 2 more energy types. So for example, Raikou Amazing Rare pictures on screen here has an attack cost that is 3 energy, lightning, grass, and metal, and that is awkward to pay, to say the least. A few of the types and type combinations had ways to accelerate that were semi-reasonable, but for the most part, they were pretty much impossible to power up, so it didn't really matter how good they were. And at this point, if you're never going to power these up, then Pokemon just decided to make them absurdly powerful, because, I mean, you're never going to attack with these, so it doesn't really matter, right? So we had a Yveltal, which just one-shotted, and we had Kyogre, which did 80 damage to all your opponent's Pokemon, which is just absurd. And pretty much all of them were absurd, except for some reason Celebi, which did not take 3 types for its attacks. It was a little weird, but anyway. So these attacks were kind of broken, but you could never pull off. But then, unsurprisingly, we got a few cards that were kind of broken that allowed you to attach essentially as much energy as you wanted, and so you could then power these up. And so they were horribly balanced. They were either really terribly awful when you could never power them up, or they were completely broken when you can get them off really easily. And while they were kind of a funny concept, in practicality, they just did not work well. Number 13, Terra Pokemon EX. Terra Pokemon EX are kinda weird. In fact, I made a whole video talking about them, but long story short, they are part of the Pokemon EX mechanic that were pretty cool because they changed types on evolution while still maintaining their original type in terms of energy cost. That being said, not all of them change type. Instead, the universally applied aspect is that they are immune to bench damage, including from your own Pokemon, which is unique, but not very interesting. So the type change mechanic's really cool, but not on all the Terra Pokemon, and has not really been explored fully. This is still being explored and coming out right now, so it's a little bit early to make judgment, but so far it's been pretty underwhelming, but not awful by any means. Number 12, Tag Team Pokemon GX. The tag team mechanic is probably the most controversial mechanic we're going to be talking about today. First of all, this mechanic was absurdly powerful. We had these 3 prize basic Pokemon with well over 200 HP, pushing 300, some even having 300, and the main idea of the gimmick was that they were Pokemon GX, but not just one, they were 2 or potentially 3 Pokemon that all kind of teamed up, and so you'd get, I don't know, some of the theming is kind of weird, but you'd have these GX attacks that you could then power up to do more something. Some of them were kind of broken, like with ADPs, you could take extra prizes the entire game, which was, well, broken. But for the most part, they're pretty fun. The lack of balance is definitely the thing that hurts them the most, and they're also somewhat straightforward, but they certainly had 2 to 3 attacks and were kind of interesting. So you could do a few different things with each of them. To be honest, I think they get hated on too much because some people just don't like 3 prizes, but 3 prizes aren't inherently broken. I mean, we just talked about Pokemon V Union. That being said, the tag team mechanic was kind of cool as you got to see Pikachu and Zekrom teaming up and a number of really cool combinations. It was also pretty short-lived and led into the VMAX era, which was a little, let's just say, not the most enjoyed, but honestly, VMAXs were an interesting mechanic and tag teams were an interesting mechanic, and together we got this 3 prize era that was fine. Some people really hate it, but to be honest, nothing too crazy. Number 11, Mega Pokemon EX. Mega Pokemon EX were a really interesting Pokemon mechanic. They were 2 prize evolutions to Pokemon EX, so they maintained the same amount of prizes they gave up, except they were more powerful, of course, but they had a major downside in addition to being evolutions. That major downside was they ended your turn when they played them. That meant that there was a massive amount of commitment, and they were really powerful, but massive risk, because ending your turn without attacking and potentially playing more cards was extremely risky. But then they released Spirit Link cards, and Spirit Link cards were tools that just didn't end your turn when you evolved them. So pretty much you had this really interesting downside in gimmick, but then you had a tool just to remove that gimmick, and quite frankly, they ended up just being kind of generic. They were balanced pretty well, which was pretty nice, and there were some cool cards, but nothing too crazy. They all generally had just like 1 attack, and were pretty straightforward. Not a bad mechanic, but I think it could have been better. Number 10, Pokemon VMAX. Pokemon VMAXs were, quite frankly, a natural continuation of Pokemon Vs and EXs. They gave up 3 prizes and were essentially Stage 1 Pokemon, which was pretty straightforward. Of course, 3 prizes are, by some, not the most enjoyed, but honestly, they're fine, and as I said with reunions, they could be balanced. And they kind of overlap with the tag team era a little, which creates some weird dynamics, and the VMAXs started out incredibly, honestly, broken and very boring as well, having only 1 attack and potentially no abilities. But then later as time developed, they became more interesting until Pokemon finally stopped printing them. So this was a little weird. By the 3rd year in which they could be printed, they just weren't really printed much at all, which is a little bit disappointing as we weren't able to see them really blossom into really unique cards. But before then, we saw some really interesting VMAXs and some really not so interesting VMAXs, but for the most part, they were a pretty decent mechanic. To be honest, the Mega Pokemon EX mechanic seemed like it would make more sense to come after the VMAX mechanic, as it's a more unique, more developed mechanic that at the same time is a bit more complex, so I feel like it would make more sense to have them printed in the other order, but VMAXs, in my opinion, just beat out Mega EXs, although I could certainly see them go either way, as they are very much parallel mechanics. Number 9, A-Spec cards. The A-Spec mechanic is the first mechanic we're going to be looking at that limits a card to 1 copy in your deck. In this case, you could only have 1 A-Spec card, and while this originally came out in the end of the Black and White era, it is actually returning in the Scarlet and Violet era, which is pretty interesting. These initially were all items and now have been expanded to various types of trainers and special energies. They actually have not been released as of the time of recording this in English, the newer versions, but they are announced and they're pretty cool looking. But for the most part, they're pretty straightforward. They aren't anything game-breaking in the sense that they don't do super unique things. I mean, some of them do, but the best ones, Prime Catcher and Computer Search most notably, are pretty straightforward. Essentially, they're just supporter cards, but on items, but you can only play 1 copy, so they're very nice when you have them, but they're not completely game-changing, in my opinion. They're not a bad mechanic, they're fine, and the one of a copy of an ace spec in your whole deck is interesting. That being said, you can only have one of any ace specs, so you probably want to put in one of the better ace specs, which were quite frankly very simple. Then we also saw a number of ace specs that only worked on specific Pokemon or types of Pokemon, and so you'd obviously play those in those types of decks and nothing else. And then there were a number of bad ones. This mechanic is not bad by any means, but also not the most interesting mechanic that we've seen. Number 8, Pokemon V, and number 7, Pokemon EX. The Pokemon V and Pokemon EX mechanics were pretty much the same mechanic. They were each basic Pokemon that gave up 2 prizes when knocked out, and especially in the case of the EX mechanic, it was a trailblazer to many of the other mechanics that we discussed in this video. There's nothing wrong with them. In fact, they were pretty cool. Of course, being basic Pokemon, they made the formats that they were in very basic focused, but nothing wrong with that. And they did later get expanded into VMAXs, V-Stars, and Mega EXs, in addition to a few other types of Pokemon, so they were pretty cool and it did activate some evolution-based Pokemon decks, which was pretty interesting. To be honest, there's nothing too crazy about them. Sure, they were released over 9 years collectively, which is a lot, meaning that we got a lot of really broken cards, a lot of really bad cards, and everything in between. We definitely got some really cool cards, and we got some really interesting mechanics that just were really interesting to interact with these mechanics as well. But for the most part, the EX and V mechanics are pretty solid. Nothing too bad about them, but nothing too insanely good either. Number 6, Pokemon EX. Wait, Pokemon EX? Didn't we just talk about these? Yeah, so this gets a little confusing and honestly is a big knock against this mechanic. The history of the Pokemon TCG is a little weird, and this is partially why I'm not going back before Black and White era. This is Pokemon EX with lowercase e, lowercase x. So that is a differentiation from the capital E, capital X, but there's actually another mechanic that might be the same mechanic that was also lowercase e, lowercase x. It's a little confusing. I don't know why Pokemon just names mechanics the same mechanics, but different mechanics. It's very confusing. But anyway, this EX mechanic is the era that we are currently in, lowercase e, lowercase x, and these Pokemon evolve from single prizers if they're evolutions, and they are not all basics, which is really interesting and much more unique. This Pokemon EX mechanic here is really cool because it allows for evolution-based decks to take the spotlight, while also still allowing for powerful basic decks. We are relatively early in this era. We have only seen just over a year's worth of cards, but for the most part, the cards are really solid, really cool. Nothing game-breaking or groundbreaking, but pretty nice and a nice change from the all basic or potentially stage 1 focused formats we've seen with VMAXs, V-Stars, Vs, EXs, Mega EXs, tag teams, and all the cards like that. Number 5, Pokemon V-Star. The Pokemon V-Star mechanic is a really interesting mechanic that gives Pokemon V's evolutions that give up 2 prizes instead of 3, so they're different than VMAXs and a lower power level than them, but they have V-Star powers, which are either abilities or attacks. That being said, the abilities were almost always better than the attacks, making the attacks almost irrelevant, and then later on we even saw tool cards that gave V-Star powers. We also saw this with GX attacks, but the GX attacks weren't very good. The V-Star power ability item cards were kind of broken, specifically one of them, meaning it kind of took over the meta. But for the most part, they were a really cool mechanic. 2 prizes again, so not too fast, but not too slow, and pretty versatile and pretty fun overall. Number 4, Pokemon Break. The Break mechanic is one of the hardest ones they had to rank on this list. First of all, Pokemon Break are evolution Pokemon that evolve from the Pokemon that they say on the card. For example, Greninja Break, probably the most iconic Break Pokemon, evolved from Greninja, making it essentially a Stage 3 Pokemon. These were quite difficult to get into play, as I'm sure you could imagine, but they had very powerful upsides, and were also additions to the previous Pokemon. They had more HP and an attack or an ability, but they could also use any abilities or attacks of the previous Pokemon. For example, Greninja Break could use the attack of the Greninja below it, which is really interesting. The way you put this Pokemon onto the previous Pokemon was by turning it sideways and covering up the top half of the Pokemon, including the image and the HP, which was really neat, but also a little bit clunky physically and made the cards a little hard to read. It was a little weird, but overall pretty cool. The mechanic was really fun and was not explored a ton, but for around a year. Overall, I think it's a very solid mechanic and one that I think many people would be happy for them to bring back, but also a little bit of a physically clunky mechanic. Number 3. Radiant Pokemon. Radiant Pokemon are almost the same as Ace Spec cards, except instead of being trainers or special energy, they are Pokemon. This actually drastically improves them, however, because they can be searched out with Pokemon search cards as well as recovered out of the prizes and discard pile, and they're just way more versatile and useful. That being said, of course, they still have the same issues of Ace Spec cards where if there are some better Radiant Pokemon, as we have seen, then they are going to be much more played. And then there are some that are more niche, which are going to see less play and be less interesting. But overall, Radiant Pokemon have been really interesting, really powerful, but not game-changing and game-breaking. So overall, they're one of the best mechanics in the TCG and are still in the TCG. So if you don't know much about them, you can just go and play with them. Number 2. Prism Star cards. Prism Star cards are regarded by many as direct upgrades to Ace Spec cards and to Radiant Pokemon. First of all, Prism Star cards are either Prism Star Pokemon or Prism Star trainers or supporters or special energy. They're grouped separately by some people, but they all have the same rule, and that is you can only play one of each in your deck as opposed to one in total. This meant that you could play all sorts of different ones, and if one was better than another, it wouldn't push out the rest. This also meant that you could have really interesting decks focused around multiple or one, or you didn't need to play any at all. And it's not like they were universally applicable, so you would pick and choose and play your favorite ones. This was really interesting, and they're also pretty well balanced. Of course, there's one more aspect, and that is, in order to stop you from reusing them, they went to the lost zone instead of being discarded. And so pretty much if they're ever knocked out in terms of Pokemon, if a stadium was bumped, then it would go to the lost zone. They had a few other special rulings, but for the most part, you just couldn't reuse them. This meant that there were these one-time threats that were really interesting, but also once you dealt with them, they were gone, which was really interesting. This is unlike Radiant Pokemon or Ace Spec cards, which can be, for the most part, recovered. And so, if your opponent gets up some of the more broken Ace Spec or Radiant cards, then they can just kind of loop them, and you will very much struggle. Prism Star cards are much more balanced and really fun overall, and many players' favorite mechanic. The only knock against Prism Star cards, specifically the Pokemon, is that they're all basic Pokemon, but that's not a huge deal. Number 1. Pokemon GX. Pokemon GX are beloved by fans. They are really interesting because just like Pokemon EX, they evolve from single prizers if they are evolutions. There were basic GXs and evolution GXs, and there were stage 1s and stage 2, so that was pretty cool. And they had GX attacks. In addition to giving up 2 prizes and being stronger than regular Pokemon, they had a GX attack, and you could only use 1 GX attack per game. This was very similar to V-Star powers, except they were all attacks, so they weren't super broken. I mean, some were quite powerful, but there weren't any that were just absurd. That meant that you could play a bunch of different ones in your deck and use them in different situations, but you also had reasons to not use a GX attack in a turn, unlike with tag teams, where generally using a GX attack was almost always a great option. This was also really interesting as many decks would run a bunch of different Pokemon GX, as we got a lot of them printed. So you could have this really unique versatility in your deck, and they're also really balanced. They also often had 2 to 3 attacks or abilities, including the GX attack, meaning that they had a lot of depth, but also weren't overly complicated. Overall, this is by far the best mechanic we've had, and one that people would love to see come back, as it is a combination of the EX mechanic and V-Star mechanic, and it's really something that Pokemon's been trying to emulate since then, but haven't quite able to grasp. And that's it for today's video. Are you mad that I didn't talk about raid battle Pokemon? Comment that down below. Also, if you enjoyed, of course, subscribe, and as I said, I'll be making more edited content in the future, especially once I hit 1,000 subscribers, so once I reach that milestone, I have a really exciting video planned, but if you have other ideas, of course, comment down below, like the video, and all that good stuff, and I'm excited to see you in the next video.